All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's great to be with you on another Wednesday at noon, ready for another edition of our program, where almost every Wednesday we get the opportunity to meet some interesting people who are doing interesting work and telling interesting stories all across North Carolina and beyond. We do science, nature, conservation, education, art history, and more. All in the service of making us smarter, at least a little bit, Hearing good stories does that. My name is Chris. I work here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, the broadcast partner with the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality that organizes this lecture series. So together, we put together this great program, bring it to you every week right here on the museum's YouTube channel. And have a good time. One of my favorite things about the Lunchtime Discovery Series, though, is that all of you, the viewers, get the opportunity to interact with the guest speakers that we have. So you can do that through the chat there on YouTube. Jump in, log into your YouTube if you'd like, and then you can leave your questions, your comments, your experiences, and type those up and post them as we go through today's presentation. That way, when we get to the end and it is time for audience questions and answers, those will be queued up for me and I can ask today's guest speaker. If you don't want to log into your YouTube, but you happen to be on Twitter, you can also tweet using the hashtag Lunchtime Discovery. People are standing by watching those tweets to make sure that they get to me so that I can see your questions as well. And we can have a great conversation about today's topic and with today's guest speaker. Now, of course, today being the first day of February, it means that for the Lunchtime Discovery Series, we are celebrating Black History Month. And it is so exciting to have today's guest speaker coming to us from a site that recognizes a very important person in the history of North Carolina, Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. Tanesha Anthony is the site manager for the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum in Sedalia and joins me now. Hi, Tanesha.
Hey, how you doing?
I am doing fantastic. I hope you are as well.
Doing really well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're really glad that you could join us for today. And looking at the title of today's talk, it looks like we're celebrating an anniversary too of these February 1 sit-ins.
That's right. Yep, February 1, the Antique 4, the Greensboro 4. Yeah, so I'll touch on those a little bit as well today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing these stories. So I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. All right, everyone. So good afternoon. Happy February 1, everyone. First, I would like to thank the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, the Office of Environmental Education and Public Affairs, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and of course, all of you joining us here today. My name is Tanesha Anthony, and I am the site manager at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum at the historical Palmer Memorial Institute. And we are owned and operated by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources under the Division of State Historic Sites. And we here at the museum, our mission is to preserve and interpret the history and the cultural legacy of Dr. Brown, Palmer Memorial Institute, and African American education. And so I'm happy to join you all today during this Black History Month Lunchtime Discovery Series. To share a little bit more about Dr. Brown and the institution she built, her influences, and the parallels that exist between education at Palmer and the civil rights movement. And of course, I'll touch on and kind of recognize the February 1 sit-in movement right down the street in Greensboro. So first, I'd like to share a little bit about the physical site and how we kind of operate. So Palmer Memorial Institute, it was a boarding school, a college prep, social finishing institution for Black students from 1902 until 1971, founded by Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. And so today we are comprised of about 40 acres with about 12 buildings and structures. The campus around the 20s and prior to that was, of course, comprised of wooden structures, constructed mostly with student labor, like you see there at the bottom in the center, the green parrot tea house, which was the student commissary. So as the school's reputation grew and resources grew throughout the years, Dr. Brown really wanted the buildings to, one, be more resistant to fire and other potential issues. And she wanted them to, two, resemble a New England college campus. And so most of the structures built later on were brick and architecturally quite impressive. And so if you visited the site today, you would have the opportunity to tour the grounds, see the outside dorms like Elliott Hall, the boys' dorm there on the bottom left, and Galen Stone Hall, which was the girls' dorm there on the bottom right. You'll be able to see teacher housing like the Carrie Stone Cottage, which there in the middle, that was teacher housing, and now we use it as our visitor center today. You'll also be able to see other school buildings like Kimball Dining Hall up there on the top right, which is where students and staff had their meals. And today we use it as an event space. And you'll also be able to tour through the inside of Canary Cottage, which was Dr. Brown's home up there on the left-hand side, top left. It was her home until she passed away in 1961. And so we continue to work to preserve the buildings and the land that make up this site so that in addition to tours and events, this site can truly be utilized as a community anchor and provide African-American community resources and educational resources on a much larger scale. And really doing that was truly the essence of Palmer anyway. Dr. Brown, she was very intentional about Palmer's place in Sedalia, and that was to educate and support the advancement of the Black community. So now I'd like to get into a little bit into the woman herself, but first I want to touch on why we won't be talking about Palmer students specifically and actually participating in the sit-ins. So Dr. Brown, founder, longtime president of Palmer, she was a pioneer, a visionary, an educator, an activist. She stood on those front lines as a master orator. She pressed for equality among races, and she just used education as another way to kind of fight this good fight. And so the February 1 sit-ins took place just 10 miles down the road from Palmer in Sedalia. This particular Greensboro movement had just recently kind of started to come to a close with the integration of the Woolworth lunch counter on February 1, 1960. And then just after that, Dr. Brown passes away in 1961. And so to our knowledge, neither she nor Palmer students at that time directly took part in the sit-ins. And there are reasons for that. Students came to Palmer from all over. They came from New York and Maryland and Georgia and Florida, even as far as the Caribbean and Africa. And so this was a social finishing school. And Dr. Brown took her work seriously. And she recognized that students were away from their families and solely in her care. And so she was sure to kind of create this beautiful oasis space where they were still kept safe. And she still created that environment where students and staff could use their education to still demand equal rights. Also, the bulk of Palmer existed before the 60s movement. And so those 60s students at Palmer, they benefited from that remarkable legacy that Dr. Brown left behind, that her students and staff would kind of continue to carry through those coming decades. And so that's kind of how I'll be framing today's talk. I will share a little bit about Dr. Brown's background, her activism, her influences, and just ways she encouraged her students and the Black community as a whole to kind of keep breaking those boundaries. So Dr. Brown was born Lottie Hawkins in 1883 in Henderson, North Carolina, and it was very close to where her family was just enslaved just 20 years earlier. When she was around about 6 years old, her mother, Caroline, who was there in the center photo, and her stepfather, Nelson, they moved the whole family, which included little brother Mingo. They moved everybody to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so while in Cambridge, stepdad, he became a tradesman. He worked different jobs around the city. And then Caroline, she also became sort of a jack of all trades. She opened a boarding house. She followed in her mother, Dr. Brown's grandmother, Rebecca's footsteps, and she became a midwife. She also operated a laundry business. And so little Charlotte, she worked with her mother often, and she recalled that there were likely dozens of children all across New England that referred to her as Sister Charlotte because she helped raise them from childhood. And so Dr. Brown, little Charlotte, had this wonderful sort of base knowledge about how to operate a business from the experiences of her mother. And so while Charlotte was a student at Cambridge English High School, and kind of even leading up to that point, she was really well known as this young, bright public speaker with many, many talents. And so at the age of 18, she was hired by the American Missionary Association as a teacher. And this association established schools for rural Black communities in the South. And so with that, she had a choice between a school in Florida. She had a choice to go teach at a school in Florida, or one in the middle of nowhere, Guilford County, North Carolina. And so obviously she chose the latter. She chose to go back home. And so after 1 year, the association closed. They closed their version of the school due to funding. But Dr. Brown, she wanted to stay, and she wanted to continue to teach and make a difference. And the community wanted her to stay and continue to make a difference. And so that summer, she went back up to Massachusetts, summer of 1902, and she did a bunch of fundraising for this school that would now essentially be hers. And so that fall, she, at the age of 19, she opened Palmer Memorial Institute. So seeing that we are environmentally focused, lots of us are environmentally focused on this call here today, I will share a little bit about how the school's agricultural beginnings kind of developed and grew into that community anchor type of place that I kind of mentioned earlier. So in the early years, Palmer leaned toward the Booker T. Washington ideals of industrial, agricultural, and domestic learning, which we'll dive a little deeper into a little later. But students ran most of the school operations. In addition to this well-planned curriculum that Dr. Brown brought with her from Boston, she had students learn to cook and to clean, to sew, to wash, to build, to repair. But the pride of the school for a long time, was that 300-acre farm. Students learned to raise crops and to raise livestock in order to sustain and maintain the school. Palmer, of course, used the most improved farming techniques, which provided purebred livestock, quality seeds for town. Palmer would hold regular meetings where other farmers could come and consult Palmer farm experts. They even hosted community corn husking parties. 1 year, 5 student farmers from Palmer produced 10,000 sweet potato plants for community farmers in 1 year. And at one point in time, we know that the school's agriculture teacher was coordinating like 31 community projects all at once. Even by the 40s, the farm was still maintained by the students, still provided the meals that were served in the dining hall. And so the success of the farm was truly one of the heights of the school's almost 70-year history. So I would like to now get into how Dr. Brown set this premise for Palmer that would carry the future of Palmer through the 60s civil rights era. And I think that it's necessary to start by recognizing an early contributor and advocate for racial equity, Booker T. Washington. So in the early years of Palmer, Booker T. Washington was a major influence on Dr. Brown. This is a woman who was educated in the North, got this quality Massachusetts education, is coming back down to teach in the Jim Crow South. And so it was because of Washington that this educational work in the South appealed to her. At an 1897 lecture given by Washington called The Negro in the South, he kind of calls on Northern Black folk, and he says, "You who have had the opportunity for education in Massachusetts should help your own people in the South. Massachusetts does not need you. Come over into Macedonia and help us." And so most of us are familiar with this like Booker T. Washington ideal of kind of temporarily settling for second-class citizenship and focusing on industrial and agricultural and domestic work. And then this is in hopes that the white community would realize their wrongdoings, learn to respect the Black community. And the idea was that in turn, Blacks would eventually acquire property and wealth and respect. And so that was his ideal at the time. So in the beginning of Palmer, the focus was on industrial, agricultural, domestic work. Teachers taught classes in agriculture, industrial arts, and home economics. The students learned by raising crops and making needed repairs to buildings and furniture. And so academics, don't get me wrong, academics were far from neglected. This was Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. But industrial and practical training at Palmer was not only necessary for students, Dr. Brown felt, but it was necessary to also expand the support of donors. And so Dr. Brown, as she grew and as she matured, she truly developed her own ideals on, of how African Americans should move through the world. But nevertheless, the exposure alone to Washington's philosophy kind of made this lasting impression on Dr. Brown. And so she actually gave a public eulogy short after his death, during which she says, "It was my great and good fortune to know Mr. Washington, and perhaps to him more than to any other one person or source, I am indebted for the small measure of success which has come to me in my field of endeavor in the Southland." So Dr. Brown, before she was the well-established activist that she became, she was influenced by some of these early civil rights leaders that we still lift up today. And so from there, she and her school just continued to grow and continued to flourish. So from the 1920s on through the 1950s, Dr. Brown really kind of successfully established herself as a public speaking figure and a public speaker and an activist for women's rights and racial equality and even immigration rights. And so she was invited to, and she gave speeches at countless conferences and conventions and graduations and all types of events. And her greatest weapon to fight this good fight was her public speaking skills. One example that I always like to share is one of Dr. Brown traveling to a women's interracial relations conference in Memphis, Tennessee. So she's at this conference and she says, "I grew up in Cambridge. It gave me an opportunity to study the white race in a way that I could never have studied them if I had remained in the South." And so she talks about the many interracial relationships that she has and that she's developed. And while she was up north, and she says, "I think, my friends, that one instance in itself proves that if we can find some point of contact, simply get close enough together to know each other, that it makes no difference in what section of the country we are, we can work out amicable relations." So she then proceeded to tell the story of her trip to Memphis a couple of days earlier. So she describes a group of like 12 white men kind of approaching her and another Black woman that she was sitting next to. They approach her and they just start harassing and like demanding that they get off. And so she talks about how afraid she was, how unacceptable the entire situation was. She actually ends up suing the Pullman car company because of this. And so at this speech, she goes on to say, I don't know whether or not there are any women here who were also on that train. But the thing that grieved me the most was that there were women in the car and there wasn't a dissenting voice. Isn't it possible for people to work together for the good of all without allowing prejudice to control their souls? And so she's so shaken up, and so she's so distraught at this whole situation. And so remember, she's at this interracial relations conference with mostly white women. And she says, the Negro women of the South lay everything that happens to the members of her race at the door of the Southern white women. Just why, I don't know. But we all feel that you can control your men. We feel that so far as lynching is concerned, that if the white woman would take hold of the situation, that lynching would be stopped, mob violence stamped out, and the guilty would have justice meted out by due course of law and would be punished accordingly. She goes on to say, we do not want our men to do anything that would make you feel that they were trying to destroy the chastity of our white women. And on the other hand, I want to say to you, when you read in the paper where a colored man has insulted a white woman, just multiply that by 1,000, and you have some idea of the number of colored women insulted by white men. And so this was during a time of heavy, heavy lynching. Black men, Black families were being publicly killed in large, large numbers. And so Dr. Brown really held this very clear and firm stance when it came to race relations and civil rights. She knew that Black folk and white folk were going to learn to get along eventually. And she kind of partially put that responsibility in the laps of white folk using this sort of plain honesty. And so I also think because of her genuine interracial relationships that she developed, it allowed others to be kind of more open and receptive to her kind of calling them out. And so as Dr. Brown, again, put herself on the front lines of this good fight by being this master orator, she brought back her students. She brought this back to her students on campus. She brought back resources they would need to fight this fight in their own ways. And this included Black leaders, civil rights, educational leaders, even artists. If she wasn't going to allow the students to go out and to participate directly, she would bring those leaders and their teachings, local and beyond. She would bring those folks to her students at Palmer. So there are many to name, but W.E.B. Du Bois was another that kind of influenced what Dr. Brown said as the premise of Palmer. Du Bois was a little bit later influence in Dr. Brown's work, but his impact on her ideals and how she ran the school, it truly lasted throughout her presidency and into the civil rights era. With a woman named Wilhelmina Crossan as Palmer's second president, handpicked by Dr. Brown to succeed her. And so many of us know the Du Bois ideals of the talented 10th. His theory was that if the ablest 1/10 of African Americans would be educated to their highest potential, then they in turn can kind of teach the masses. And the idea was that this would be a solution to the Black person's plight in America. And so that was the idea at the time. But if a talented 10th did exist at all, it did so at Palmer Memorial Institute. This is where those social graces, that high quality academic education, the cultural arts, the fine arts, this is where all of that came into play. And so students were given tools to communicate and present themselves effectively. From Dr. Brown's 1940 speech, The Negro and the Social Graces, and then her book, The Correct Thing to Do, to Say, to Wear, students were kind of prepped and armed for intellectual battle. They were taught that this, with a graceful demeanor, coupled with high quality education, would kind of put them in positions to fight this good fight in a way that ended in the advancement of African Americans as a whole. And so to the rest of the world, the Du Bois and the Washington ideals were totally opposite, and they could not possibly exist together. But to Dr. Brown, they were part of this beautiful foundation that kind of upheld her own principles and her own ways of raising the next generation of Black people to succeed in society. And so this is a conversation that continues to live and to thrive, especially here at the museum. So Dr. Brown, obviously, she held reverence for the male leaders of the time, but she was sure to kind of take the meat, leave the bones with that. Their theories could sometimes leave room for doubt. I mean, during this time, especially when it came to the role of women and African-American women. And so Dr. Brown, she studied and was inspired by and encouraged by and followed the footsteps of powerhouse women educators that came before her. Women like Maria Baldwin, there on the far left, and then Lucy Craft Laney there next to her. One a Northern educator, one an educator in the Jim Crow South. They left lasting impressions on Dr. Brown and her educational philosophy. And then Dr. Brown was also good friends with Nannie Helen Burroughs and Mary McLeod Bethune, the two to the right. And both of which, like Dr. Brown, contributed to this good fight by educating the next generation. She and Bethune and Burroughs were so close that they ended up being recognized as the 3 B's of education. So Dr. Brown exposed her students to boundary-breaking artists like the poet Langston Hughes, who guest lectured in the English department at Palmer, also got Ebony Magazine to come and do a story at Palmer. Also Nat King Cole, which was Dr. Brown's nephew-in-law. He would perform benefit concerts at Palmer. She recruited people like Lois Mailou Jones there on the far left, who traveled the world as one of the first African-American painters to be renowned abroad. And this woman established the art program at Palmer. And so all of these were activists themselves, representing the future of Black music and Black art and Black literature. And Dr. Brown would be sure to bring these folks and their resources back to her students. So Dr. Brown, the activist and the club woman, she was part of and sat in leadership positions of countless local and state and national organizations. She was a founder of the North Carolina Federation of Negro Women's Clubs, whose motto is "Lifting as we Climb." And she served as president for 2 decades. She was also a member of the North Carolina Teachers Association, and she served as president there from 1935 until 37. And as a leader in the North Carolina Teachers Association, she really fought for things like upgrading inferior African-American educational facilities, obtaining better pay and better treatment of African-American teachers. And so she used her work in these organizations to kind of instill in the youth that she came in contact with a sense of moral obligation, racial pride, the desire to become truly just the best that they could be. She was an honorary member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She participated in the YMCA, the YWCA. She served on the American Interracial Peace Committee, the American Youth for Democracy, the Civil Rights Congress, the Committee on Interracial Cooperation, the National Association of Colored Women, the National Council for Negro Women, where there she served as the head of a financial campaign advisor committee. And she served there along with Eleanor Roosevelt. She even served on the American Committee for Protection of the Foreign-Born. And so she realized that African Americans weren't the only ones that were lacking civil rights in America. And so that's a long list, but that was truly only to name a few. The list goes on and on and on. So everything up until now has been to kind of show how Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, being an early activist herself, she did a great job at laying a framework for what was to be sort of a training ground for Black excellence. And so Dr. Brown created this culture at Palmer where students learn to use their education and their social graces to kind of go out into the world and gracefully and sophisticatedly demand equal rights and equity among all American citizens. And so the 1960s Palmerites were not permitted to take part in the protests and the marches and the demonstrations. But these Palmerites, they did become politicians and educators and artists and business owners. And so Palmer created those very students that went on to obtain the higher education at places like A&T and Bennett College. And so maybe not those current 60 students, but former Palmerites, I'm sure, still found their way to be part of this direct action that was happening across the country. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Brown, she passed away in 1961 at the age of 77. Miss Crossan, Miss Wilhelmina Crossan, she was personally selected by Dr. Brown to be the second president of Palmer. And she had already been carrying the torch since 1951, when Dr. Brown stepped down in 1951. And so during this time, Jim Crow had made himself comfortable in the South. Civil rights movement was underway. The Greensboro sit-in had just ended with this integration of the Woolworth lunch counter. And so Palmer wasn't a stranger to the movement. So Crossan, in the spirit of Dr. Brown, Wilhelmina Crossan was sure that students took action, but they took action with their talents and their knowledge and their abilities. At a Founders Day celebration at the school, Wilhelmina Crossan delivered the main address, and she says, "Take your inheritance in this school as a trust from the founder, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and the world will be reborn. It is your world." And so Wilhelmina Crossan saw Palmer through the height of the movement. She continued to add value to the students' educational experiences. She introduced a bunch of programs to Palmer, including the Peace Corps volunteer training work in Liberia. She had students travel to New York and to Washington, D.C., and she wanted them to experience kind of sort of the finer aspects of urban culture. And she saw this as educational development. And of course, she revved up instruction in African American history. And so Crossan really just truly continued on prepping students in the ways that Dr. Brown would have seen fit. And she truly got those students through those 60s years, through that civil rights movement, the height of the civil rights movement. So Dr. Brown and Palmer students, they may not have walked a mile from A&T's campus to the Woolworth counter in downtown Greensboro. They may not have sat down in the whites only section with the students from Bennett College and Dudley High School and Women's College in Greensboro. Palmer students may not have marched down Elm Street during the protests, and their names may not have been Isaiah Blair Jr., Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, or David Richmond. But Dr. Brown and Miss Crossan in the true spirit of Palmer, they were sure to send the youth that they had impacted out into society to be this beautiful being of knowledge, and to show support for the A&T4s of the world, and to show just how Black excellence can really be, and how education and social graces can be valuable tools to fight this good fight in ways unimaginable. So with that, I finished a bit earlier than I expected, but I want to say happy February 1, everybody. Happy Black History Month, and thank you so much for your time.
Happy February 1 and happy Black History Month. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
An amazing story. Dr. Brown clearly was an incredible person.
Very much so. Very much so.
So viewers, if you've got questions or thoughts you want to share, get those typed up, drop them into the chat. I'll be looking to you for your thoughts and comments, and we've got some time here to have a great conversation. So I guess something that I was thinking about, Tanesha, as you were going through, is the site that you're at today, with the institute, the house, the 40 acres that people can come and visit there and learn this story. I know before the show you said you only started in this role recently, but what's been your experience of visitors coming to this site and hearing and experiencing the place and the stories?
Yeah, so it has truly been, it's been fantastic. I am truly enjoying my time here. Visitors come, most of our visitors are ones who drive this main road in front of us every single day, and they finally build up the courage to stop by and say, I've seen you every single day. And so when they're done, they're like flabbergasted almost that they drive past this place every day. And so 9 times out of 10, we see them a couple of weeks later with the rest of their family members. So that's always wonderful. And then another thing that kind of has really impacted me are the alumni. So the school ended in 1971. So we still have alumni very active. There is an alumni association, and they get together like every other year for reunions. And so it is such a pleasure to see these alumni. They are truly just pleasant people. And they've got that, a lot of them, I mean, they're getting older. And so a lot of them are from the 60s now. They're like graduates from the 60s. And so they've got a little bit of spunk to them. And so it's just awesome. It is truly awesome just getting to know them and hearing their stories and just learning from their experiences. Even the older ones that we get to come every now and then, and they're, of course, like I said, they're getting older, but those ones that were able to be in the same space as Dr. Brown before she passed away, it's just very humbling, and it's just wonderful to be able to talk to folks like that.
Oh yeah, that feels like that would be very special.
Very special.
What are some of the challenges and rewards of preserving and managing the grounds and historical aspects?
Okay, yeah, sure. So challenges. If you leave anything just kind of sitting there, it's going to, develop issues. So we are very careful, and we make sure that we're making like needed repairs and things to kind of keep the grounds and the buildings up and sustained. And in the future, we're hoping to kind of develop and change these buildings into things that we can use to truly be a community resource and a community anchor. But the rewards are just truly just seeing visitors walk through here and they compliment the grounds and they're like, oh, this is so beautiful. And they're really truly getting the most out of their experience. And we also take pride in making sure that the campus looks how Dr. Brown would have wanted it to look. She was big on, the aesthetics of her campus, and she made sure that it was well landscaped. And so we really just try to kind of carry on that legacy and try to make sure that we are doing what Dr. Brown would have wanted us to do with this space. And so it is a challenge because there's a lot of space, a lot of buildings, a lot of grass to cut. But it's truly rewarding on the other side of all of that.
What would you say are some of the real rewards that come from it? I mean, you mentioned, having people who live nearby or drive past it every day come and visit. I know as a science educator working at a science museum, I am inspired by people when they, become inspired or they're awestruck by a plant or an animal that they didn't know much about. I imagine, I'm going to guess, as an educator yourself at a site like this, seeing a story like this resonate with people must be pretty exciting.
Absolutely. Every single time. And it is just it's just really rewarding to be able to tell Dr. Brown's story and the story of the students here. And really, I am just looking forward to kind of continuing to build and continuing to develop these grounds and this campus so that we can just be used for a lot more than just tours and events. We can be used for so much potential. So we can definitely be used for a lot more to benefit the community.
A question that's come in: are there parts of Dr. Brown's life that you wish you could include in the grounds that aren't currently there?
So we do a really kind of good job of covering Dr. Brown's life, her activism, her roles in the community. If I'm thinking, is there something that I wish that we could include? I think we do a pretty good job. There's also always things that, I can add, or, always information that I could add on to the interpretation of the space. But I think we do a great job at kind of covering her lifespan. And so, of course, less than a year in, I'm still learning things every single day. And so, I'm sure there are plenty of things that we could, stand to include or to add to our interpretation. So, but that's something that we're working on every day. We're working on expanding our interpretation and including those things that maybe we didn't touch on that much here, or maybe we just mentioned a part of, and maybe we want to expand on that. And so that's something that we're continuing to work on is expanding our interpretation.
It puts me in mind, does the site do any sort of collecting of stories? Is there like a community science part of this where people can share stories? Because there must be people in the Sedalia community still around when Palmer was active that maybe even if they weren't students necessarily, would have seen the benefit, or would just remember it being a part of their communities, their neighborhoods too.
Yeah. So before this current staff, there were some oral histories that were done, and so we just got those digitized. And so we do have some wonderful oral histories of folks that went to Palmer, administrators at Palmer, students at Palmer, students or folks from the town of Sedalia. And so those are our kind of official records and things like that. But we love to sit down and hear a good story. Anyone that comes to the building that says, oh, my dad went to Palmer, oh, my aunt, my cousin went to Palmer, oh, my great aunt went to Palmer, anything. We love to sit down and hear a story, hear a good story. And so we always take that into consideration as well when we kind of give our interpretation. That always helps us kind of frame in certain ways and kind of set this kind of groundwork for what we're about to talk about. So we love a good story. We'll sit and we'll listen all day from folks that come by and just had any kind of connection to Palmer.
Lovely. Do you have a favorite building or area of the grounds?
That is a wonderful question. That's a question that I ask myself. I've been wanting to kind of decide on that in myself. I want to pick a place that I know that this is my favorite space. So I haven't chosen yet. It's hard to choose. Some of my coworkers have their favorite spots on campus, but right now I think I would have to say Dr. Brown's gravesite. She's buried on campus at her request. She's buried kind of in between where her office would have been and her home. And so the gravesite was just recently re-landscaped by the Architecture and Landscape Department at North Carolina A&T. And so the students there, they did just an awesome job of just beautifying that whole area. And so I think right now, that's definitely my favorite spot on campus right now is Dr. Brown's gravesite.
Certainly a great spot for memorizing or memorializing and remembering. Yeah. And like you being here, telling the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have to say I was struck by the bit of the speech that you shared with us that Dr. Brown delivered, and how closely it sounded and mimicked things that, I might see on my social media feeds from today's activists about how it takes everyone participating and speaking up in order to find justice and achieve equality. I guess there wasn't so much a question in that.
But no, she's ahead of her time. She was ahead of her time in so many, history repeats and stuff, but in so many aspects, she was just so forward thinking and so ahead of her time. And so that's another reason why she's just this remarkable woman, is because she wasn't afraid to kind of say things that were not, it was like borderline acceptable during that time. And so she wasn't afraid to say it. And it's so remarkable how she was able to do that and still continue genuine relationships and still, receive genuine support from white Northerners, white Southerners, Black Northerners, Black Southerners, everyone. So she was truly remarkable in that way.
So where did, obviously she was able to garner a lot of support. An institute like Palmer wouldn't have been inexpensive to run and operate. So where did students come from? How did things like tuition for the students, upkeep of the grounds when it was operational? Seems like it would have been a big bill. So can you talk a little bit about how Dr. Brown brought all of those things together in order to create this space?
Sure. So at first it was pure just grind. She would go up. She spent that summer of 1902 before she opened the school. She went back up north, and she was going to like hotels and meetings and churches, and she would sing. Like she would fundraise. She was on a grind. She was truly, she grinded to get the money that she wanted or needed to open the school. And so that's how she started. And then she continued that grind, but she got smarter. She got more efficient. And so she started to kind of build relationships. She wasn't afraid to reach out to people that other folks were like, they're never going to reply to you. She would be like, yes, they are. And she would reach out to them, and she would continue to reach out. And so she was relentless. And so a lot of her donors were Northerners, were white Northern liberals from the North. That's where she was raised. It was where she made a lot of her connections. And so she was able to kind of garnish that support. And then using that support, she got support from those folks down South. And so all of this kind of culminated into her being able to sustain the school. Also, students kind of worked to maintain the school. They worked to maintain the farm. They worked to offset the cost of their tuition. And so there were some rough patches throughout this 70-year history, but in the 40s, the 40s was like the heyday of the school. And so there was a time where the school had eliminated debt and they were fully self-sustaining and fully self-functional. And so she was remarkable in that way too. And I couldn't tell you exactly how she did all of that and how, how she stayed on that grind for so long. But it took a lot of hustling at the beginning, and then she got smarter and more efficient. So she was very strategic, and she used all of that to her advantage and to the advantage of her students.
That's fantastic. So let's see. The folks from the Office of Environmental Education have shared a question from Andrea. How did the town of Sedalia react to Palmer Institute's aspirational endeavors during the challenges of segregation and separate but equal course of our country?
So in the beginning, it was a bit of back and forth a little bit. The town is like, who is this Black woman who is walking in here all nicely dressed? She got this Northern accent, what is she doing here? What is she gonna fix for us? And so, but Dr. Brown, being the kind of just this outgoing spokesperson that she was just she came with this honest endeavor. She came with honest intentions. And so it did not take long at all for the community to kind of get on her side. And the proof was in the pudding. She started educating the community. She started, making sure kids had clothes that were nice enough to come out and get, come to school. And she made sure that, students were able to have those skills to work the home and work the farm and, work the machinery and build and all of that in those early years. So yeah, at first it was a little bit like, who is this Northern woman coming here down South? But she was very good at kind of being honest and having wonderful, true intentions. And that, of course, it wins people over every time. True intentions and honesty, it wins people over every time.
Let's say another one for you. Were the students at Palmer ever criticized for not participating in the sit-ins?
That's a good question. And I guess criticized by who, because at Palmer, it was an oasis. It was a space that Dr. Brown curated intentionally. And so, all the students were kind of in the same boat. And so, it's not that I, disagree with I don't disagree with the movement or the purpose of the movement, but you're 16 years old and you're from Maryland and you're all the way here in the middle of nowhere, Guilford County. And so I'm going to make sure you're here and I'm going to make sure you're safe and I'm going to make sure you stay that way. But I'm going to educate you in other ways to be able to go off into the world and fight this fight when you're able to, when you're old enough to. And so, to my knowledge, I'm not sure if they were criticized by, outside folks. I'm sure Dudley High School students kind of picked on them sometime, but other than that, no, this was truly an oasis space and all the Palmer students were in the same boat.
Yeah, excellent. Let's see. And then with the time we've got left, can you tell us about your personal path to the museum?
Yeah, it's not as interesting as Dr. Brown's, but
I
it's
don't
cool.
know.
It's cool. So yeah, let's see, 2009, I'm originally from Lynchburg, Virginia. And I came to A&T in Greensboro to go to college, and I kind of stuck around after I graduated. I majored in liberal studies, race, class, and culture. And I also kind of did a little minor in music education. And so after I graduated, I became a music teacher. And so I taught elementary music for about 6 to 8 years. And then towards the end of that, I really got this spark for public history. My granddad was our family historian, and so he had recently passed, and so I'm getting all of this like inspiration. And public history was always something that interests me. It was like this guilty pleasure. And so I decided, look, I'm going to take this kind of seriously. I think I can, move into it. And so I went and got my master's in public history from Southern New Hampshire University. I got an internship, the Robert Frederick Smith internship through the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. And through that, they placed me at Stagville, historic site in Durham, North Carolina. And so I did some exhibit work there. I also did some work at the Greensboro History Museum with collections and the registrar work. And I also did some docent work at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro. And so all of that just kind of made this perfect storm for me to kind of swindle my way into the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum with the Department of Natural Cultural Resources. So I've had a weird kind of interesting journey. I also did some work with Girl Scouts, community outreach for Girl Scouts. So we went into low-income housing and Title I schools and bringing the Girl Scout program to them. So that kind of brought me here. And so I'm happy to be here. And I've got this nice little set of skills and knowledge in my pocket from all of these, community and education things that I've done. And so I'm happy to be here to use all of the skills that I've learned.
I was about to say, don't put yourself down at all. You were like, well, I don't know if this all fits together. It's like, no, it sounds like all of these pieces just like come together really well. I'm glad you work for the state and with the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Like, I'm glad you're on our team.
Thank you.
It sounds like you're I might be projecting, but it sounds like you're in just like a great spot that these experiences and your knowledge and expertise in this role is well suited. Yeah.
Yeah, and it took me getting here to like kind of realize that. I didn't realize it until I got here and started to do the work, and I'm like, I'm kind of equipped for this. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, Tanesha, thank you so much for sharing your story and that of Dr. Brown's with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely.
And to all the viewers, thanks for being here with us as well. We're going to be celebrating Black History Month with great presentations and stories like this for the rest of the month. Next Wednesday at noon, we'll be right back here. You'll have a guest host next Wednesday, Laura Beth Spear. Laura Beth is going to take great care of you, I promise. But next week, we'll be talking to a PhD candidate at North Carolina State University, Murray Burgess, who's doing field work and also just co-created a new organization called Field Inclusive, raising awareness about scientists who do field work who are people of color. So that's going to be great and exciting. Murray's doing really cool research and also advocating to make sure that everyone has access to the resources they need to participate in science. So that's going to be awesome. It's going to be great. Don't miss it. Mark your calendars. Next Wednesday at noon here at the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Make sure that you're following the Museum of Natural Sciences on social media. We're at Natural Sciences everywhere you could find us. And then the Office of Environmental Education is at North Carolina EE. And then you can see information about upcoming presentations at either of our websites. So you can head to naturalsciences.org, or you can head to eenorthcarolina.org. At that website, you can also sign up for the email newsletter that's associated with this lecture series. You can get those YouTube links in your inbox every Wednesday before the talk. It'll be right there at the top, so you can come and join us. And then I'll also say, make sure that you check out the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources websites, because there you can get information on how to visit places like the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum and take full advantage of the great resources that are available to you across the state of North Carolina. With that, I'll say thanks for visiting, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.